Lowe's knows how to help you get the most out of your store run. That's why members save more with My Lowe's Rewards. Earn points towards My Lowe's money on eligible purchases. Get access to member-only deals and free member gifts. Plus, unlock free standard shipping when you reach Silver Key status. So what are you waiting for? Join for free today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. In an effort to keep this show going and one day be supported without ads, I'd like to invite everyone listening to become a supporting listener on Patreon. For as low as just $1 a month, you can enjoy listening to various standalone series such as the 7-part series on Poland's 11th century, as well as complementary series that seek to fill in the gaps with information that didn't quite make it into the public show, such as the series called Context of a Conquest, in which we learn about various goings-on happening in the background of William the Conqueror's conquest of England. We're currently enjoying a series called The Book of Alexios that has already shown the rise of Alexios Komnenos, and will be updated with the bits of his story that don't affect the main storyline of our public show. If you support what's happening here and want to hear more, please head over to Patreon and become a supporting listener. The link is in the show notes of this episode. Now, the battle for the city of Durazzo is imminent. This is episode 137, entitled 1081 Battle of Durazzo. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. It's mid-October 1081, and Robert Guiscard has led a suffocating siege on the city of Durazzo for the better part of 3 months and counting. He's lost countless men already to everything from surprise sorties bursting from the city's gates to disease within the camps. But he was not a man to turn tail and run. Things, however, would change when the Eastern Roman Emperor himself arrived at the head of thousands of reinforcements, which included not only Byzantine Greeks, but also many of the empire's traditional enemies, such as Seljuk Turks, Pechenegs, and Bulgars. All told, Alexios rode at the front of upwards of more than 16,000 soldiers. The way the city of Durazzo was set up, just to give us a lay of the land here, was that it was a circular walled city with an opening to a natural harbor. Remember, the harbor is where Guiscard wanted to push his fleet into, but the sudden arrival of the Venetians made this impossible. On the landward side to the east was a natural lagoon as well. On the southern end of the lagoon was a bridge, but if the bridge was inaccessible for whatever reason, one had to travel north around the lagoon to get to the east banks of it. The thing about the bridge crossing the southern part of the lagoon was that this bridge lay right along the Via Egnatia that emerged from Durazzo from its southeastern gates. I should mention that Robert Guiscard, by Alexios Komnenos' arrival in mid-October, Guiscard was in firm control of that very bridge. Thus, he was in firm control of the beginning of the Via Egnatia, leading in and out of Durazzo. Guiscard was in a great position, all things considered. Alexios moved his army across the northern edges of the lagoon. He established a perimeter and then established a safe passage between his camp and the city itself. Now at this point, he summoned all men in leadership roles to his imperial tent, which lay within sight of the Adriatic Sea. Serious deliberations took place, but one group was missing at first. Georgios Palaiologos and the contingent from inside Durazzo was not willing to leave the city while it was under siege. Alexios sent for him again, the messenger offering promises of safety. However, after what Palaiologos had already been through, he didn't trust really anyone. Anna Komneni tells us of Palaiologos' response to the messenger, quote, "It seems to me absolutely fatal to leave the citadel while it is under siege. Unless I see your majesty's seal ring, I will not come out." End quote. Alexios immediately sent the ring, and Palaiologos relented. Once there, the meeting could begin. Anna tells us that Palaiologos led with a full update about everything that had occurred, and when he was finished, Alexios asked him if he should engage the Normans in battle. According to Anna, quote, "Palaiologos categorically stated that he should not." End quote. Knowing the ferocity and intelligence of his opponent, Palaiologos warned against an open battlefield fight. However, he was also aware of the living conditions of the Norman camps, and they weren't looking too good at all. Palaiologos, arrow wound to his temple still fresh, advised a war of patience. He advised Alexios to blockade the Normans and their mercenaries and suffocate them, leaving them hungry and cold and without proper medical care. Remember, winter was approaching. Time and nature would be their greatest weapons against a man like Robert Guiscard. Now, unfortunately, the youthful and inexperienced officers pushed for battle. Anna tells us, quote, "The majority of younger officers preferred to fight, especially Constantine Porphyrogenitos, Nicephorus Cynodenos, and Nampites, the commander of the Varangians, and even the sons of the former emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, Leo and Nicephorus themselves." End quote. Gathered around Alexios were some heavy hitters in the Byzantine military and political complex. While these discussions were happening in the Byzantine camp, envoys were sent to Guiscard. This is where we left off previously. Alexios simply asked Robert Guiscard why he was even there in the first place. Guiscard is reported to have responded with this, quote, "I have not come to fight, your majesty. That was not my intention at all, but rather to avenge the wrong done to my father-in-law. If you wish to make peace with me, I too welcome it, provided that you're ready to fulfill the conditions stated by my ambassadors to you." End quote. The thing is, Guiscard, again, as his name implies, had no intention of not fighting. The father-in-law he spoke of is the deposed Emperor Michael VII, so his terms to avenge him essentially amounted to placing Michael VII's son, Constantine Ducas, on the throne, and his own daughter, Helena, as his empress. Guiscard knew full well that these terms would never be accepted, and yet he offered them anyway. So, as Anna Komnene pointed out, by setting what she calls, quote-unquote, impossible terms, and claiming he doesn't want to fight, we know what his intentions were all along. Besides, we have forgotten that he spent months preparing an entire navy and ground forces, complete with prefab siege engines. Nobody ever really wants to fight, but the odds of the enemy standing down, well, they're almost non-existent. Guiscard did throw in a dangling carrot, though, to be fair. He promised Alexios that should he accept the terms when Guiscard would hold the lands he called Lombardy, essentially he's referring to his portion of the Italian peninsula, only at the pleasure of the emperor, and that his Norman forces would be available to assist Eastern Rome when they called for it. Now, honestly, some more Normans were exactly what Eastern Rome needed to handle things in Anatolia, so the offer must have intrigued Alexios. However, it was fleeting at best, and Alexios outright denied these terms, predictably. At this point, Guiscard does something somewhat rare in the post-Athenian democracy and pre-Enlightenment era. Guiscard goes all democracy on his barons. Anna Komnene, who would have no way of knowing what he said before battling her father, I mean, she wasn't even born yet, to be fair, let alone Guiscard was on the opposite side of the conflict. Well, she does write a speech that Guiscard supposedly gave to his barons outside of Durazzo. Take it for what it's worth, but I do think it serves as a pretty good summation of how the Normans went into war with Alexios. It also serves as another example of Guiscard's cunning, which might have been her thinking all along. Guiscard supposedly said the following to his men, quote, "You know the wrong done by Emperor Nicephorus Botaniates to my father-in-law, and the disgrace suffered by my daughter Helena when she was thrown out of the palace with him. Finding Finding this intolerable, we have left our country to avenge the insult and punish Botaniates. But he has been deprived of his throne, and now we have to deal with a young emperor and a brave soldier who has acquired an experience of the military arts beyond his years. We must not take up his challenge in a light-hearted manner. Where there are many masters, there will be confusion, brought about by the diverse strategies of the many. In future, therefore, one man among us should command the rest. He should consult all, not adopting his own schemes in an autocratic way, and according to his own caprice. The others will openly express to him their own opinions, but at the same time accept the counsel of the elected leader. And behold, I myself am ready, first among you all, to obey whomever you choose as leader." End quote. So there you have it. You can clearly see a little propaganda with the whole, young emperor and brave soldier talk from Anna. But William of Apulia backs the gist of this speech up with his account of Guiscard putting the role of the leader of the campaign up for a vote. But we know how it would end. Who else would be voted if not Guiscard himself? Guiscard played the humble role, apparently, denying the vote at first, but he ultimately took control. If anything, trick or not, if true, Guiscard forced everyone to, buy into what was about to happen. They voted him under the pretense of it being a choice. If they deserted at any time after this, then that would be a clear mark of shame. Anna records him after accepting the burden of leadership as saying this, quote, "Listen to my advice, you counts and the rest of the army. We have left our own native lands and come here to fight against an emperor of great courage, one who has only recently seized the helm of power, but has won many wars in the reigns of his predecessors and brought to them most powerful rebels as prisoners of war. All our energies, therefore, must be devoted to this struggle. If God grants us the victory, we shall no longer be in want of money. That is why we must burn all our baggage, whole our transport ships, and send them to the bottom of the sea. And take up this challenge from him as if today is the supreme decider of life and death." End quote. With this, history in fact does record that Robert Guiscard ordered all of those ships burned and destroyed. Other sources record the exact same event. For instance, Malaterra writes, quote, "The Duke saw that battle was imminent and decided to force his army to fight more fiercely for him by removing all hope of flight. So he burned all his ships which lay safely at sea to prevent the cowardly avoiding the savage battle with which our men were threatened by fleeing to them in the hopes of being carried home." End quote. He then adds a heart-pounding detail. Each army, Norman and Byzantine, were encamped 4 stadia from the other. Now, Richard Brown, historian, explains that according to Pliny the Elder, a stadium is the distance of 125 paces, or 625 feet. These armies were a mere half a mile apart, or about 3/4 of a kilometer. That's nothing. Guiscard's army had to be all in. There was no going home until the job was finished. His barons agreed, and the navy was dismantled and the supply ships were soon resting on the bottom of the sea, as Guiscard's speech from Anna's work explained. Now, between October 16th and 17th, one traveling back and forth the half-mile between the two forces would have seen a flurry of activity happening. Both sides were organizing and reorganizing, a constant flurry of movement and shouting, clanging of swords as they warmed up. If you remember, the makeup of Guiscard's army was of any boy or man of fighting age, with or without prior fighting experience. Well, something else was happening on Guiscard's end with this in mind is nicely summed up by Malaterra. Quote, "There was confusion and clamor in the camp. Some people were terrified, but others, stouter of heart, encouraged the less valiant and gave them courage." End quote. It's a great reminder to all of us that, soldier or not, the vast majority of people fighting these battles throughout history were men and boys out there for no other reason but loyalty to their ruler. They were inexperienced and terrified most of the time. The idea of a standing army has popped up from time to time throughout human history, but it wasn't anywhere near being the norm until much, much more recently in our history. It's a good reminder that the armies we tend to romanticize in our minds were largely made up of scared farmers and laborers and merchants until recently. But these men, these boys, they showed up and they fought, and without them, our world would be very, very different indeed. Now back to our story. Malaterra also tells us that the nights of October 16th and 17th were hours spent with increasing tensions. Those 2 nights, we're told that Guiscard volunteered to command the first watch, while Bohemond, his son, commanded the second watch. We always read that battles took place on such and such dates. The thing is, though we know these dates today, no one, and I mean no one, knew it then. The hours and days leading up to a battle were suffocatingly tense more times than not. Each of those 2 mornings, Malaterra tells us, soldiers would wake to the sounds of hymns being sung in the dewy, pre-dawn air. It was common in these hours before battle that these men would hear the panicky cries of longing for their homes, their families, their mothers. They would look around and see full-grown men kneeling next to other full-grown men who had fallen to all fours, vomiting and wailing in anticipation of the death and carnage they would soon experience. Priests would make their rounds to them all each morning, hearing confessions for hours and hours on end, and offering Holy Communion for those who fully expected to die that day. You can imagine if that day saw no battle, it would just restart the next. Now, on the night of October 18th, the battle was entered. Alexios decided on a surprise attack that night. He would have one contingent attack from the city side of the Normans' main encampment. Another contingent would attack from the east side. He would send the bulk of the army through the salt marshes, a considerably longer route around, mind you, in order to attack from the rear. And he himself would lead the frontal assault. When all were put into place, he would signal the command to attack, completely encapsulating the enemy and hopefully snuffing out the flame of the Norman invasion in one single night. Durazzo would be safe. He would either stand over Guiscard's corpse or have the man in chains, and he could set out back to Constantinople within a week's time. There were no obstacles to this plan, except one: Robert Guiscard himself. Guiscard knew that battle was imminent. It's been clear for a few days now. He just didn't know when. But he also knew of the military genius that was Alexios Komnenos. Again, despite what we may think today, something I will repeat forever on this podcast, the medieval world was abuzz with news of foreign kingdoms. Merchants were the internet of the day, and they spread news and rumors like a high school journalism class. Guiscard ordered his men to a nearby monastery devoted to the martyr Theodorus, which was located in a flat plain near the sea to the southwest. There, the barons stayed inside and prayed and participated in confession, as well as all the other Catholic rites one might partake in prior to battle. The lay soldier would funnel into the church, do his prayers and communion ritual, and then funnel out so more could do the same. Guiscard pulled these men out of the encampments in the area to do this just after dark, leaving all the lights on in the tents, you could say. Now, rumor came that Alexios' forces were carrying out their orders, so Guiscard cut it all short and lined his men into 3 main contingents. At the same time, Alexios realized that Guiscard had left the encampment altogether and recalled his forces in a hurry. To the east of both Durazzo and the Church of St. Theodorus is where the 2 armies would square up to one another. Guiscard was to remain in the center, which consisted of a mixture of various fighting men, including spearmen, archers, and heavy cavalry, which was made up of the elite of Norman mounted knights, the tanks of the day. On his right was his son Bohemond, leading an infantry unit, though he did have a small band of loyal knights riding by his side. And on the old fox's left was a contingent of light cavalry led by a fierce Apulian baron named Amicetus. As for Alexios Komnenos, his forces far outnumbered his Norman opponent, but few of these were actually Greek soldiers. There were numerous units of Muslim Turks who were being paid handsomely for their services to the emperor, and these warriors were put in the front of all three contingents as they were meant to serve as the harassers as the Normans drew closer. These Turks, as we know, were deadly with both bow and lance. Alexios took control of the center opposite Guiscard, and behind the Turkish archers were Turkish light infantry. Behind them were spearmen and infantrymen. And behind them was the band of heavy cavalry that he himself was a part of. To Alexios's left was his brother-in-law, Nicephorus Melesinos, yes, the same man who tried to take the throne of Eastern Rome, while Alexios was also trying to do the same. They had remained fast friends through the ordeal, and Melesinos was now named Caesar. He was part of those negotiations. Now, Melesinos was always a loyal brother-in-arms to Alexios, a fierce warrior in his own right, and Alexios was without question stronger with Melesinos at his side. Melesinos was leading a contingent consisting of those Seljuk archers in the front, a mixture of spearmen and Turkish light cavalry in the middle, and then his own unit of heavy infantry. And finally, mirroring the makeup of the left wing was a contingent led by Alexios's new Megas Domesticos of the West. That's right, Georgios Pekorianos, another one of Alexios's oldest and most loyal men. Those on the Patreon feed will recognize these names. It's worth noting that Alexios was able to negotiate terms with a large unit of Serbian cavalry, both light and heavy, under the leadership of their Catholic king, it should be noted, Catholic king, Constantine Bodine. Now, Bodine decided to keep his Serbs in the rear to be called if things got too hairy. But really, we've seen this time and time again, but really, he wanted to see how this whole thing would play out. Remember, the Normans were loyal to the Pope in Rome, and Pope Gregory VII recognized the Kingdom of Serbia, and he as its king just a few years earlier. The rift of 1054 was still echoing in the background all the way up to the year 1081. Now, to boot, Alexios made an interesting decision, no doubt leveraging some animosity within his ranks toward the enemy. Alexios did not keep his Varangian guard close to him, as many other emperors have done. Varangian translates to men of the oath, and that oath is to protect the emperor at all costs. Varangians were the Praetorian Guard, or the Secret Service of Eastern Rome. Traditionally, as we know, Varangians were mainly Rus or Scandinavian Vikings who brought their battle axes to Micklegard to accept employment under the emperor. But after 1066, those of the Viking occupation weren't the only deadly and dreaded warriors to join the guard. The Anglo-Saxon men, who had served at Hastings and suffered through the subsequent decade of defeats and purposeful famines and needless wanton destruction of the conqueror, the new King William I of England, well, these men left England. They simply didn't belong there any longer. Their England had changed irrevocably, and they wanted no part of it. We know on this podcast the very clear and strong ties between England and places like Norway and Denmark, and many of these Anglo-Saxon men fled to these places. We know this for a fact in the example of King Harold Godwinson's family, who fled to Denmark after Hastings. By way of Denmark and other Scandinavian ports of call, these Anglo-Saxon men found their ways through Germany and Hungary and the Balkans, or through Poland and Rus territories and the Black Sea region, and they began funneling into Constantinople by the hundreds, all hearing about the Varangian Guard and the richest empire around, willing to pay for mercenaries to protect its vast and threatened borders. Then they caught word of this Norman in southern Italy, preparing to invade their new home, their new empire. And the fury and rage began boiling within their chests. Alexios sniffed this out in a hurry, and he made the bold decision to place these fuming Varangian warriors, these new Anglo-Saxon expatriates, right at the vanguard of his army. He would give them the opportunity to exact revenge upon their sworn enemies, the Normans. As the sun rose behind Alexios' army on the morning of October 18th, 1081, they saw Guiscard's army already lined up and ready. Guiscard immediately sent a unit of light cavalry ahead to check the vanguard's defenses. When they passed halfway, Guiscard ordered his entire army to march forward. The light cavalry was unable to budge the Varangians, and very few died on either side. The fighting was over as soon as it started, but much was learned in the exchange. When the cavalry came back around, they noticed Alexios had ordered the entire line of Seljuk archers to run ahead of the Varangian guard, fling a few volleys of arrows over the no man's land between the armies at the Norman light cavalry, and then flee behind the mighty Varangians before much damage could occur to their lines. Though the Varangians were virtually unscathed, Guiscard did lose a handful of riders in the exchange. I imagine a scream of victory from the Varangians led by their Anglo-Saxon leader Nampites as the Normans turned tail. When the light cavalry returned to the center with Guiscard, Amicetus' right flank pushed forward to engage the Varangian vanguard. Seeing this, Alexios ordered his full force forward. The Varangians were severely outnumbered, but they held their ground with exceptional valor and ferocity. In fact, by the time Guiscard's and Bohemont's contingents reached Alexios' front lines, the Varangians alone had pushed Amicetus' entire right flank, not only out of the center of the battlefield, but off the battlefield proper. And they didn't stop pushing either. The anger and the resentment in the hearts of the Anglo-Saxon warriors must have permeated the entire atmosphere of the battlefield itself. As Guiscard pushed his army forward, he witnessed Amicetus' flank drift behind him, pursued by vengeful, bloodthirsty Varangians. But the Varangians were now out of the way. The arrows raining down on his men were devastating, but they pushed through to slam into the Seljuk archers that lined the front of Alexios' army. Looking back, Guiscard could have seen in the distance Amicetus' men running toward the sea away from the screaming Anglo-Saxons chasing them. Anna Komneni writes, quote, "Our men," that is, Varangians, "resisted bravely, and the enemy turned back, for they were not all elite soldiers. They threw themselves into the sea up to their necks, and when they were near the Roman and Venetian ships, begged for their lives, but nobody rescued them." End quote. Remember, Guiscard had ordered his entire fleet to be sent to the bottom of the sea. His men had nowhere to turn to when their boots reached the waves. It's almost as if he knew what would happen. Now, while this was going on, we learn that someone else was lined up on Guiscard's right flank along with its leader, Amicetus. Guiscard's own wife, the indomitable Sicilgata, had suited up and rode into battle as well. This lady was amazing. Now, this was not unusual for her, and it seems Anna Komneni had a healthy level of respect for this lady because of what Sicilgata, whom she calls simply Gata, by the way, does while the Norman lines are running away. She writes of this woman, whom she likens to a Valkyrie, quote, "There is a story that Robert's wife Gata, who sued to accompany him on campaign like another Pallas, if not a second Athena, seeing the runaways and glaring fiercely at them, shouted in a loud voice words which were equivalent to those of Homer, but in her own language, 'How far will you run? Halt! Be men!' As they continued to flee, she grasped a long spear and charged at full gallop against them. It brought them to their senses, and they went back to fight." End quote. Sicilgata. I wish more was written about this remarkable warrior and lady. I imagine her story occurring alongside her mighty husband, Robert Guiscard, was one of equal importance to our collective Western history. Unfortunately, we just don't know a whole heck of a lot. So, The problem was, on the battlefield, the problem was that Nampites had pushed his Varangians a bit too far away from Alexios' main army. They were not only looking at a resurging Norman force led by Sikelgaita and Emicetus, but looking back, they saw that the battlefield in the distance showed they were also behind Guiscard himself. They were stuck. He ordered them to stand and fight right there. Here would be the Normans' Hastings, if he had anything to say about it. The two groups clashed, and the Varangians were too winded to fight back. They were battling light infantry for the most part, while they had chased them wearing heavy Anglo-Saxon armor and helmets and wielding heavy battle axes. It wasn't a fair fight. But when is war ever a fair fight? What's more was that when they looked back again, they saw lancers and archers, no doubt ordered by Guiscard, who must have had his head on a swivel at this point, barreling toward their rear. Emicetus' contingent and these lancers and archers from Guiscard's center together slaughtered the Varangians right there, though a few managed to escape to the nearby church of the Archangel Michael. Interestingly, the Archangel Michael had become a symbol and figure of reverence by the southern Normans since the earliest Normans were approached by a Lombard outside a cave-turned-shrine dedicated to the Archangel Michael back in 1016. Emicetus and Sikelgaita ordered their warriors to chase the surviving Varangians to that church where they saw the doors to the sanctuary barred. The small building, it's worth noting, must have been jam-packed with Anglo-Saxons, because there were even Varangians sitting on top of the roof in order to stay safe. Emicetus, in a stroke of viciousness, ordered the church itself to be set on fire. The result was a complete victory over the Anglo-Saxons within Alexios' lines by the Normans, just like those Anglo-Saxons at Hastings, as well as those who fought for the emperor versus Roussel de Bayeul a few years earlier. It was merely another lesson of Norman superiority over the Anglo-Saxon fighting man, which is saying something because the Anglo-Saxon warrior was certainly something to behold as well, as it was the English who had kept all manner of Scandinavian invader at bay for the better part of 3 centuries. The 11th century, inside England or outside England, it just wasn't the century for Anglo-Saxon success. Now, back behind Alexios' forces, who were engaged in a melee with Guiscard's forces, was, as I said, King Constantine Bodin, standing at the head of a Serbian unit. When the smoke rose from the church in the distance and word came of the destruction of the entire Varangian guard, Bodin ordered his men to abandon Alexios Komnenos on the battlefield. He took more than 5,000 Serbian men from the fight. This was utterly devastating. Seeing this, Guiscard pushed harder into Alexios' lines. He ordered all of those heavy cavalry units who had been waiting patiently right behind the fight forward. Let me break from the action to point out one military innovation that was just beginning to sweep Europe in the 1080s. We see it first mentioned around this time, and it will become such an integral component to our future chats about chivalric warfare and tournaments. See, heavy cavalry, like the type that Guiscard just sent right at Alexios, well, they made a slight alteration to the way they held their lances. It's a small point, but I can't understate the importance of it. Instead of relying on a small wrist guard and a tight grip to hold the lance firm as it impacted a person, they began to widen the wrist guard to keep the hand from sliding up the lance, and they began holding it close to their side, like right up against their side. If you're thinking of what you've seen in the movies with jousting scenes, you've got the right idea. It was in the 1080s when this tactic first began to take shape and take hold. Innovations will perfect it over the course of the next century or two, but again, we first hear of it during this time period. This almost ensured that a lance that landed would certainly pierce the armor of the enemy. To repeat, this was the power Guiscard just unleashed on Alexios' army.
This episode is brought to you by Hyundai. Think you know what an electric vehicle should be? Think again. From the charge time and range in the Ioniq 5 and 6 to the 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N, Hyundai is redefining what EVs should be. Learn more about Hyundai EVs at HyundaiUSA.com. EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Actual range may vary.
At the exact same time as Guiscard's tank-like heavy cavalry started their charge across the battlefield, those who had slaughtered the Varangians and burnt the church had quickly caught up to the battle and joined the fight. There was nothing Alexios could do when all of this happened all at once. The Varangians, they were no more. Only the handful of stragglers who didn't quite make it to the church remained. And with the annihilation of the Varangian guard, right there outside of Durazzo, we see the climax of the battle itself. It was as if the air itself carried the message of Varangian defeat, thus demoralizing the rest of the 1,000-strong Byzantine army. Now make no mistake, the destruction of the Varangian guard sucked the life out of the Greek army. Georgios Theotokos, in his book Bohemond of Taranto, writes, quote, Alexios found himself in a position where his division in the center became exposed to enemy cavalry attacks from the front and left flank. Guiscard was quick to appreciate the great opportunity he was landed with, and he immediately threw his elite knights into the ongoing melee. The impact of the cavalry attack on the morale and discipline of the Byzantine army was decisive. Some units did stand and fight courageously, but many of their comrades abandoned the fight and ran away, with the entire front soon disintegrating rapidly. End quote. At this point, essentially, Guiscard's heavy cavalry cut right through the light infantry and Seljuk archers like a hot knife through butter. And behind Alexios, when he looked back, the dust of 1,000 horses were seen where just minutes earlier stood the Serbian knights in reserve, awaiting orders to join the battle. The Byzantine army was collapsing before Alexios Komnenos' eyes. They scattered in all directions, and within minutes, Alexios was left on the battlefield with a small unit of spearmen and a few loyal knights of his own. Amicetus, still stinging from embarrassment from being bullied by the much smaller Varangian guard earlier that morning, decided to take it upon himself to push himself ahead of the main Norman army right at the emperor. 2 other men were with Amicetus, identified as Peter, son of Alexios, and a man who, quote-unquote, was at least their equal, says Anna. They joined Amicetus and they attacked the emperor directly. Anna describes the scene like this. She's just such a great writer. Quote, Amicetus missed the emperor because his horse swerved slightly. The emperor parried the spear of the second with his sword and with all his strength wounded him by the collarbone, severing his arm from his body. The third aimed a blow directly at the emperor's forehead, but with great presence of mind, Alexios, coolly and not at all alarmed, recognized in a flash what he had to do in that split second. As the blow fell, he leaned over backwards toward his horse's tail. The sword point just grazed his skin, immediately causing a slight cut, but was impeded by the rim of his helmet. It cut through the leather strap, which fastened under his chin, and knocked the helmet to the ground. The Celt then rode on past him, thinking he was unseated, but the emperor drew himself upright and sat firmly in the saddle, with all his arms intact. In his right hand he held his unsheathed sword. He was dusty and blood-stained, bareheaded, with his bright red hair straggling in front of his eyes and annoying him, for his horse, frightened and impatient of the bit, was jumping about wildly and making the curls fall over his face. But even so, he recovered as best he could and defied his adversaries. End quote. Described by his daughter Anna as, quote-unquote, an impregnable fortress throughout this whole battle, this scene right here is almost too awesome to be believed. If true, Alexios Komnenos lived through one of the coolest moments in military history, in my estimation. But he was, in this same moment, forced to flee. The battlefield now devoid of Byzantines and their mercenaries, Guiscard ordered his men to chase down the emperor and bring him the body, either dead or alive. Guiscard himself ordered his officers to reconvene back at the Church of St. Theodorus to assess the situation. The victorious soldiers did what victorious soldiers did. They scoured the battlefield for valuables left on the corpses of the dead, enemy or friend. And we'll leave it here for now. On the next episode, we find out if Alexios Komnenos survived his terrifying ordeal as he fled the battlefield outside Durazzo, and what Guiscard decided to do next. No matter what, this was a resounding victory for Normans everywhere, and a defeat on par, according to modern historians, with that of Manzikert just 10 years earlier. In the span of 15 years, not only have the sons of Normandy consolidated southern Italy and the Kingdom of England, but they also managed to overcome Muslim Sicily, and now, as if it were a cherry on top of everything, they have bested not only Eastern Rome, but Eastern Rome's beloved and most respected military leader in generations. The Battle of Durazzo was one for the ages, that's for sure. And if you can believe it, it's not exactly quite over yet either. Thanks for listening. Until next time.